Are you confused with the who's who of royalty? Getting confused between your Edwards and your Henrys? Did you even know that Queen Elizabeth wasn't the only queen we've ever had? I'm going to be teaching you a crash course on the British kings and queens over the ages. We're going to be figuring out how everyone is related, the lines of succession between the houses, and find a little bit about who these kings and queens were as rulers. There have been many kings and queens of Britain over a period of 150 years or so. Queen Elizabeth II is descended from the very people we are discussing today from the 10th century, which is just crazy to think about. Today we'll be discussing the complicated subject of who to start with. Who exactly was the first king of England? We have an especially confusing line of royalty, a history that I love exploring, but where do we begin looking at the timeline of British royalty? Many sources have very different options for this, and as historians, we love to disagree and debate about these kind of things. From 410 to about 1066, there were numerous kings and queens who were claiming the title to England. But who could be considered the first? First, we find England in 410 BC under the Roman rule. Romans had settled and enslaved many of its native inhabitants, and they left in 410 due to the collapse of the Roman Empire, resulting in attacks from neighbouring bands who saw their region as free from defence. So, who was left? Well, we had the Britons, who were native to Britain, and they were never really too organised as a nation-state. So we have the King of the Britons, who, again, wasn't necessarily the king in the sense that we find today. And they began to be attacked by the Picts from up in Scotland. Now, the Britons invited foreign warriors to help protect them, and so they did, but they also decided that they liked this free land and took it themselves, driving many of the Britons out west to modern-day Wales. These included the Angles from Germany and Saxons from Saxony, creating the name Anglo-Saxons. And they later created 7 regions: Wessex, Essex, Sussex, Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, and East Anglia. So Britain at this time was not actually a united England. There were 7 different kings in each of these regions, and many different levels of power and rule between each of them. Our first king option is Egbert, who ruled from 1802 to 1839. Officially, he was king of Wessex, but was one of the first kings to hold control and power over some of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, establishing Wessex as a central power hub for the first time. However, there were still tensions between the region, no sense of unification, and many of these kingdoms were still autonomous, and they were still considering themselves separate nations. It is during Egbert's reign when we have some of the first major attacks on English soil from the Vikings. Vikings sailed from England mainly from Denmark and Norway, initially just attacking monasteries and towns for goods and gold. However, they soon began to settle permanently, predominantly in the northern regions of England and in the territory of Northumbria. Several Viking leaders called themselves kings and established rule over their own territories, and they actually continued to capture and expand themselves. Now, could we not also consider these kings as perhaps the first kings of England? Well, they were technically kings and they were in the region. However, many historians discount them completely from this race just because they were not technically English in blood. Now, next up is the most popular option, Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, who ruled from 886 to 899. Alfred is famous for laying the foundations for a unified Anglo-Saxon nation. And as king, Alfred faced the most intensive threats from foreign invasions by Vikings from the north, and eventually found his own kingdom of Wessex, surrounded by advancing Viking threats against the Great Heathen Army, as it was called. This was really a comeback story for the possible Anglo-Saxon collapse, but Alfred led Wessex to success as he brought together Wessex and Mercia, and his efforts led to the Anglo-Saxon nation that was later taken over by his son and grandson. Now, Alfred actually did call himself King of the English, not necessarily King of England. However, his rule does represent the start of this first unbroken line of the English kings. So, really, he was the first house of Wessex, and from there we see all of the royals follow from that. So, technically not of England, but they did first here call themselves the English, and this is when we first hear the terms Angleland being thrown around. Another option is Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, who was the first ruler to use the title King of the English in 927. This was when he captured Northumbria, the last remaining of the 7 original Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He was the first to rule over the larger region as we recognise today as modern England, and really unified these borders. He even attempted to conquer further lands as well. However, was this actually the beginning of an unbroken line of English royalty? Not quite. Athelread the Unready lost his crown to the King of Norway, who took over England in 1016. This was Cnut the Great, who established a line of Viking king rule over England. Now, he actually ruled over an empire at this time, ruling as the King of England, Denmark, and Norway all at once. This was a period of relative intermingling with the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, and the king and his descendants created a sense of unification in the land once more. Later down the line of succession, we once more find another English king on the throne. This was Edward the Confessor, who in 1042 dies without an heir, and this led to a huge mess. Who was going to take over the throne? Now, this led to a rather famous battle called the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where 3 people were battling over the throne: an Englishman, a Norman, and a Viking. This leads us to our next popular option, William the Conqueror, who claimed he was promised the throne by Edward the Confessor and attacked from across the Channel from Normandy. He took over the crown in 1066 from the triumphant battle at Hastings, which you might have heard of. Now, this battle is often cited as the beginning of England itself. However, I don't think that we can really ignore the previous 600 years to this battle of intermingling with the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and all the kings who came before him. William's succession did, however, end the back and forth between the Viking and Anglo-Saxon rule, and did establish the royal line as we know it. In fact, he became the last conqueror or outsider to succeed to the throne. And so the debate still stands. Which of these kings is the first of English royalty? We first have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. When was the formation of England as we know it today? And do we consider the modern borders to equal what England was in the past? Or are we counting England as the idea of England, as a unified nation of people? This could be the formation of the entity of the English people itself. I lead towards considering the formation of England as occurring when the inhabitants were faced with the powerful foreign enemy and came together as a force against it, and stood up for themselves as a nation. We see that predominantly with Alfred as the ultimate comeback king who brought the people of England together and was king of a land that went from separate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into one that saw itself as a unified force fighting against the Vikings. So now that we've discussed how complex it is to pinpoint who we should be considering as the first king of England, we can see how so many sources have very different answers to this question. Personally, I believe Alfred the Great should take that title, but what do you guys think? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. Now join us next time when we delve into questioning who the first Queen of England was. And thanks for watching.